Okay, so today we're going to move on into the thoracic vertebrae. Now, a couple things we look at. We already have covered the lumbar vertebrae. Now when we compare it to the thoracic vertebrae that we have here, you can tell that there's some differences. One is the size. The body, if we look at the thickness of the body, the thoracic that's in my left hand is much smaller, the body is, than the lumbar body over here. This right here is probably about a T5, T6, so a mid-thoracic. And this is this is a lumbar number 2. So you got mid-thoracic, mid-lumbar. So roughly in the middle of their respective sections of the spine. And you can still tell that the lumbar is quite a bit bigger on the block side. If we turn around to the back, another thing that's pretty obvious in the difference is the thoracic vertebrae has a very long, prominent spinous that points downward, where the lumbar has more of a thicker spinous that points out and a little bit down. So you need to know the difference between thoracic and lumbar. You do not need to know the difference between a T6 versus a T12 or any other thoracic vertebrae. Same with the lumbar. You don't need to be able to tell the difference between an L2 and an L5 or anything of that nature. Does that make sense? What's important as you go down the spine, the bones get larger. Lumbar vertebrae are going to be larger in size than thoracic vertebrae, and thoracics are still going to be larger than cervical. Cervical vertebrae are going to be the smallest, okay? Just because there's less weight as you go up in the spine, okay? All right, so kind of a quick review that we're going to talk about here. Thoracic vertebrae, we have the body. Still, we got the anterior elements. We have the pedicles on both sides. Pedicles will come back and meet the lamina, which are right here. At the pedicle laminar junction, we have two processes that come off here. We have the transverse process on both sides. Then we also have the superior articular process on both sides. The body, the posterior body, the pedicles, and the lamina come together. And then off of the lamina, we have the spinous process. These structures create this opening called the vertebral foramen for the spinal cord to pass through. This is just like what we had in the lumbar spine. Now, if we look at the superior articular processes and facets, first off, when we look at this, we said that the superior articular facets face posterior, and on the lumbar spine, they're posterior medial. And basically, this creates more stability because it kind of basically just creates a posterior and side-to-side orientation. You'll notice when you study the thoracic vertebrae that these posterior facets flatten out and face completely posterior. The reason for this is we're making our way from the lumbar spine, where we start at the hips where our structure is like this, and then through the lumbar spine it starts to turn like this, and then in the thoracic spine it faces completely posterior. When we get into the cervical spine, we're going to see that this posterior facing superior articular facet is then going to start to lean forward, and then by the time it gets up to the top at C2 and C1, the superior articular facets face upward like this. What would be the reason for that? What's at the top of the cervical spine? The skull. So it creates a platform to hold the skull that way. So hip structures like this from side to side. In the lumbar spine, we work our way medial, posterior. And then thoracic spine, we're posterior. Cervical, we start to work our way superior to hold the skull. Okay? All right, now, the other thing to look at is the inferior articular process on the thoracic vertebrae. On the lumbar vertebrae, this inferior articular process sticks out and is more prominent than in the thoracic vertebrae. In the thoracic vertebrae, it looks like it just has this extra little half circle on the end of the lamina, which is what you can see here. So basically, if we draw a line, this area right here, this is the inferior articular process right there. On the anterior side, you would find the smooth inferior articular facet. That way, they face completely anterior. That way, when we have the superior articular facet facing posterior, the inferior one that faces anterior will meet right up with it, and they'll sandwich together and make a facet joint. Okay? So, the structures we need to talk about that are new to the thoracic spine. What is the hallmark of the thoracic spine is that each thoracic vertebrae has a pair of ribs attached to it. So we have 12 thoracic vertebrae. we have 12 pairs of ribs. So you have a rib on the left and a rib on the right. Now, what happens here, and I've got these tagged, I've got the pink or red at the top, and I have this green at the bottom. And so what will happen is the rib will articulate, this part called a rib head will articulate there, and then we've got this green bump on the rib that will articulate with the transverse process. So let's name these structures. So let me see, on this one here, I'm going to shade this in here in pink, and then the bottom is green. Let's go ahead and add this to this diagram. Sometimes they'll show this on a diagram and sometimes they will not, but we're going to know these structures. The pink is called the superior costal. You guys remember what costal means? Rib, yeah. So I'm going to put in parentheses rib. So superior costal demi-facet. So what does demi mean? That means a half facet. So there's a little divot, if you will, almost like a little dimple. And so on this diagram, it shows the superior costal demifacet, but it actually shows it as a full circle, but actually more of a divot. And then on the inferior side of the thoracic vertebrae, on this posterior corner, we have another divot. This is the inferior costal. So we'll make sure that's rib. Demifacet. So since these demifacets are considered half facets, when you stack two thoracic vertebrae together, the half circles are going to meet up and they're going to create a full facet, if you will. Okay? Now, in our notes, the superior costal demifacet and the inferior costal demifacet, if we stack a couple bones together like this here, all right, we'll just draw them out. I'll put our disc in. Okay? What's going to end up happening is these demifacets will form a full facet for the vertebrae to attach to. Okay? The drawing's not the greatest. So I'm going to put in brackets these two right here. We'll say that they combine to form a costal facet. And this costal facet for rib head articulation. So the rib head, we're going to learn about rib anatomy here in a few minutes. The rib head articulates to these costal demifacets. And when we get to the ribs, we'll see how the rib articulates with those thoracic vertebrae on another slide. Okay. Now, before we do that, the rib head articulates on the posterior corners of the vertebrae, but then the tubercle of the rib on this rib anatomy will articulate with the transverse facet. Now, this slide says facet for tubercle of rib. Well, that is more telling you what it does. The name of it is a transverse facet. Okay, and we'll just put rib tubercle articulation. That's what happens there. So, thoracic vertebrae have all the same structures as a lumbar vertebrae, except for you have to add superior and inferior costal demifacets for the rib head, and you have to add the transverse facet for the rib tubercle, all for rib articulation. Okay. Then we'll move on to the ribs.